Now, I want to tell you about a place that erased a woman. Not with cruelty. Nothing that obvious. They just stopped saying her name. Dropped it out of conversation like a coin down a well. After a while, the silence where her name should have been got so big that people walked around it without even noticing anymore. Elkhorn, Wyoming, January of 1883. Little town, maybe 200 souls if you counted generous. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business and had opinions about all of it. And the business they had the most opinions about was the Holbrook girl. Nobody called her by name anymore, just the Holbrook girl, or Orrin's daughter, or if they were feeling particularly charitable, that poor thing up on the ridge. The preacher wouldn't perform her wedding ceremony. Tried twice, matter of fact. Both times the groom took one look, heard the silence where vows should be, and walked right back out the door. Something happened the winter before. Nobody talked about it plain. They talked around it. Like water moving around a stone in a creek, you could see the shape of what they were avoiding without ever seeing the thing itself. But nobody asked her. Not one soul in that whole town walked up to that ridge and asked that woman what happened. They just decided they already knew. Josiah Dunn rode into Elkhorn on a Tuesday that could have frozen the horns off a brass bull. He owned a horse named Patch, a bedroll that smelled of wood smoke and loneliness, and exactly nothing else worth mentioning. 29 years old, and every one of those years had taught him the same lesson: don't stay anywhere long enough for people to notice when you leave. He'd drifted through 3 territories since autumn, worked cattle in Montana, fixed fence in Dakota, kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that nobody on God's green earth would notice if he dropped dead in a ditch tomorrow. He heard about the offer at the saloon. Old Orrin Holbrook, dying slow on his ranch up the ridge, offering the whole spread 600 acres, good water, strong timber to any man willing to marry his daughter. Every fella in the county turned him down, the barkeep said, wiping a glass. Something wrong with the girl. Josiah finished his whiskey. What's wrong with her? She don't talk, ain't said a word in over a year. He set down his glass. A woman who didn't talk and 600 acres of good land. He'd had worse offers. He'd had no offers at all. Mostly. The Holbrook Ranch sat 2 miles north of town, white with snow and quiet as a held breath. Big house, good bones. Barn needin' work but standing solid. Cattle huddled against the wind in the south pasture. A curtain moved in an upstairs window. Old Orrin Holbrook gripped Josiah's hand from his sickbed with more strength than a dying man should have had. His eyes were clear despite the fever eating through him. You marry her. You get it all. The house, the land, the cattle, everything. Yes, sir. But you don't ever make her speak before she's ready. Orrin's grip tightened. That's my only condition. You break it. I'll haunt you from the grave, and I ain't joking. Josiah looked at the old man's eyes. Whatever had happened to this family, the father still had fight left in him. I ain't much for making people do things they don't want to, sir. Orrin studied him a long moment, then nodded. That's the first honest thing any of them said. You'll do. Nora Holbrook had cataloged every man who came to look at her like damaged goods on a clearance shelf. The first was a widower from Laramie who smelled of tobacco and kept saying, there, as though she were a spooked horse. The second was a rancher's son who spent the entire visit talking to her father about acreage while she stood by the kitchen stove like furniture nobody had ordered. This one was different. She watched the ceremony from somewhere behind her own eyes, the way she'd learned to watch everything since the silence began. The preacher, Reverend Lyle, the Marlowe's own cousin, the man who'd told her to keep her mouth shut for the good of the community, stood before them with his Bible and his tight little smile. Do you, Nora Holbrook, take this man? Silence, same as before. The preacher shifted his weight. Josiah Dunn stood beside her, turning his hat by the brim, smelling of trail dust and cold air. She waited for the sigh, the shuffle, the mumbled excuse and the boot heels walking away. Instead, he said, quiet and easy, I'll say mine. That's enough for today. And he did. Simple words, spoken plain. He didn't look at the preacher for permission, didn't look at her for a reaction, just said his piece to the empty air between them like he was making a promise to the room itself. Doyle, the ranch hand who'd worked for her father since before she was born, stood as witness. His old eyes were wet. He'd been the only one. That night Nora locked her bedroom door. Iron bolt, solid oak. The only sound in the house was wind against the eaves and the settling of old timber. She lay in the dark listening for his footsteps in the hall. They didn't come. Come morning. She cracked her door open to find firewood stacked careful and neat right there on the floor. Small logs, split clean, enough for 2 days. He'd carried them up without making a sound, hadn't knocked, hadn't left a note. Hadn't done one single thing that required her to respond. She stood looking at that firewood for a long time. Then she closed the door, reached for the bolt. Her fingers rested on the iron. She didn't push it home. 2 weeks in, Josiah had learned 3 things about the Holbrook Ranch. First, the land was good, better than good. Sheltered valley with a year-round creek, south-facing pastures that would green up come spring, timber enough to build twice over. Orrin Holbrook had chosen well 40 years ago. Second, Doyle knew every inch of it. The old ranch hand had more knowledge in his calloused hands than most men carried in their whole heads. He didn't talk much either, but when he did, it mattered. Third, Nora was everywhere and nowhere. He'd find evidence of her: a swept porch, a mended fence rail, a lantern trimmed and filled, but she moved through the ranch like weather. Present but untouchable. Every morning he put coffee on before dawn. Black, strong enough to float a horseshoe, set a cup on the kitchen table and went to the barn. Every morning the cup was there when he returned at evening, washed clean, set upside down on the counter. She'd touched it, drunk from it, washed it. A whole conversation without a single word. What happened to her? He asked Doyle one afternoon while they broke ice off the water trough. The old man was quiet a long time. Wind cut across the pasture carrying snow like flour off a board. She told the truth, Doyle said finally. Town decided they liked the lie better. Josiah waited. Marlowe family been running cattle off the small ranches for years. Everybody suspected. Nobody said nothing. Nora had proof, brought it to the preacher, then to the general meeting. Doyle's jaw worked. Preacher's the Marlowe's cousin, told her to keep quiet for the good of the community. When she didn't, they turned the whole town against her. Called her a liar, troublemaker. Said she was unstable. Was she right about the Marlowes? Right as rain. But being right don't count for much when the whole town decides you're wrong. Josiah set down his axe, a woman who'd spoken truth and been punished for it. And now everyone wondered why she went silent. He left a slate and piece of chalk on the kitchen table that evening. Wrote in careful letters, "What should I plant come spring next morning?" The slate sat where he'd left it. One word in a hand so precise it looked like penmanship from a school book. Lavender. He stared at that word, touched the chalk dust with his finger. Not wheat, not corn, not anything practical or profitable. Lavender? He smiled for the first time in weeks. Nora hadn't meant to write anything. She'd come downstairs in the thin gray light before dawn, same as every morning, expecting the coffee and the silence and the careful distance he kept like a fence he never asked her to cross. But the slate sat there with his question, and something in the plainness of it, a man asking about seeds. Nothing more broke through a crack she hadn't known was there. The slate became their language. He left questions. She left answers, never about her past, never about feelings. He asked about the ranch, the land, the practical things of living. East field or west for the early hay east. Drains better. Chicken coop which corner needs fixin' first southeast. Wind comes hardest there. Found your father's planting journal. Want it? She'd stared at that one for a full minute, then wrote, yes. He left it on her chair, not handed to her, not placed where she'd have to reach past him. Just there, on the seat where she sat, like it had always been waitin'. He was giving her decisions, not asking for confessions. She couldn't name the moment she understood that only that the shadows had shifted, and the light was different now. One February afternoon, Doyle came back from town with supplies and a look on his face like he'd swallowed something sour. That Marlowe woman, he muttered to Josiah by the barn. Stopped me at the store, asked how the little wife is, still playing mute. Doyle glanced toward the house. He didn't know Nora was listening from the kitchen window, playing mute. Nora's hands went still on the dishcloth, not trembling, not hurt, furious. She hadn't gone silent because of Mrs. Marlowe. She'd gone silent because she'd spoken the truth, and every person she trusted had looked the other way. The silence wasn't fear. It was a verdict on all of them. That evening she stood at the kitchen window, watching Josiah work the fence line in failing light. Snow on his shoulders, breath clouding white. Patient as the land itself, she opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Thank you," she said to the empty kitchen. Just to hear how her voice sounded after all this time, it sounded like rust on a hinge, like something opening that had been shut too long. The coat nearly undid him. Josiah found it folded on his saddle in the barn. His work coat, the one with the torn sleeve he'd been meaning to fix since October and never had. The tear was mended with small to precise stitches. Thread matched perfect. He held the sleeve up to the lantern light and ran his thumb along the seam. She'd come into the barn, his space, while he was in the far pasture. She'd found his torn coat, and she'd fixed it. Nobody had fixed anything for Josiah Dunn in 29 years of living. His mother died when he was 6. His father drifted into a bottle and drifted right out the other side. He'd raised himself on other people's ranches, other people's charity, other people's leftover attention. He sat on the hay bale holding that coat for a long time. That evening she sat at the kitchen table while he ate. First time, no words. She just appeared, cup of coffee between her hands, and sat across from him like she'd always been there. He didn't comment. Didn't look up too quick. Just ate his beans and biscuit and let the silence hold whatever was growing inside it. He pushed the slate toward her out of habit. She didn't write. "The east field drains better." Her voice was low, rough at the edges, barely louder than the fire crackling in the stove. Josiah's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He didn't drop it, didn't stare, didn't make a single motion that might spook whatever was happening. "Eastfield. Then," he said. She nodded, sipped her coffee, and that was all. But the air in that kitchen shifted the way air does when a window opens after a long winter, sudden and sweet, and full of something you forgot you'd been missing. Later, Doyle told him more. The Marlows had been stealing cattle for years. Nora had documented every head, every brand alteration, every midnight ride, brought it to the preacher first. When he shut her down, she went to the town meeting. The Marlows' response was swift and total. Turned her friends against her. Her father fell sick around the same time. No allies, no voice, no one to stand beside. Josiah lay in the barn that night, coat pulled tight around him, the mended sleeve pressed against his cheek. "I know you're in there, Nora Holbrook," he whispered to the dark. She found his bed in the barn on the first day of March. Nora had gone to return the slate. She'd started keeping it with her now, writing thoughts that weren't answers to questions, but just things she noticed, things that made her wonder, and there it was. Horse blankets spread over hay, his few clothes folded neat as a soldier's kit, a small mirror hung on a nail, and her father's almanac, dog-eared and studied, notes in the margins in Josiah's rough hand. He'd been sleeping here, in the freezing barn, since January, 2 months, every night, while she had the whole house to herself, the fire, the quilts, the solid walls. He'd been out here with the horses and the cold, and nothing between him and a Wyoming winter but a horse blanket. He'd never said a word about it, never sighed when he came in from chores, never mentioned the cold or the discomfort, just gave her the house like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nora sat down in the hay and put her hands over her face. She cried. Not for herself. For the first time in over a year, the tears weren't hers. They were for a man who owned nothing and gave everything he had to a stranger who wouldn't even speak to him. She picked up the almanac. His notes were careful, practical. Rainfall patterns, soil types, best grazing rotation for the south pasture. He was learning her ranch, not for himself, for her, so the land would be ready when she was. That evening she waited by the stove. He came in from the last chore, stomping snow off his boots, heading for the barn like every night. Nora held out the quilt from her bed, didn't speak, just held it toward him. Josiah looked at the quilt, looked at her. His eyes asked a question he'd never say out loud. She pushed it into his hands. Their fingers touched. First time. His were ice cold. Hers were shaking, but not from cold. He took the quilt. Much obliged, he said. Odd. She nodded. She turned back inside. Next morning, the front door of the house stood open for the first time since January. His coffee was on the table. But this time, she'd made it. The storm came out of nowhere on a Wednesday in mid-March, the way Wyoming storms do, sky blue at noon, black by 2, and then the world disappeared. Josiah heard the fence go down before he saw it, sound like a tree splitting timber posts snapping under the weight of ice. North fence line, the one that kept the cattle from drifting into the ravine. He grabbed rope and ran. The door behind him banged open. He turned. Nora, wrapped in her father's old coat, was right behind him, moving fast. "The north line," she shouted over the wind. He nodded. "I know a better way." She grabbed his arm and pulled him east, away from the trail he'd been using all winter. "There's a draw past the cottonwoods' natural shelter. If we push 'em there, they won't scatter." She knew this land. Every gully, every ridge, every shelter break. She'd grown up running these hills when she was a girl who talked plenty and laughed loud, and nobody had yet told her to be quiet. They worked side by side for 2 hours. Nora shouted directions through the wind, left at the creek bed, watched the ice shelf, the yearlings drift east, cut 'em off by the big rock. Her voice was hoarse from disuse and raw from cold, but it carried strong. Josiah followed her lead, her ranch, her land, her call. They drove the cattle into the sheltered draw and lashed the broken fence with frozen hands. Doyle appeared halfway through with more rope and a lantern, checked on them once, then headed back to watch over Orrin. When it was done, Josiah and Nora stumbled into the barn and collapsed against the hay, soaked, shivering, hands numb, breath coming in ragged clouds. Then Nora laughed. It came out of her like water breaking through ice, sudden and messy and so alive it filled the whole barn. She laughed at the frozen hay in her hair and the mud on her coat, and the absurdity of 2 people who barely spoke saving 40 head of cattle in a blizzard. Josiah stared at her. He'd heard the silence. He'd heard the single words, the short sentences, the practical directions shouted through wind. But this laugh was something else entirely. She stopped laughing, looked at him in the lantern light, snow melting in her hair, her cheeks flushed red, her eyes bright for the first time since he'd known her. "My name is Nora," she said. "Nobody's called me that in a year." "Nora," he said. Just the name, nothing else. She closed her eyes. "Again, Nora?" She smiled, and the storm outside howled. But in the barn, there was warmth and lantern light and 2 people who'd found each other in the space between silence and speech. The spring town meeting was held at the schoolhouse on the last Saturday of March. Snow mostly gone, mud drying, the valley floor greening up in patches like a quilt being stitched together by unseen hands. Josiah and Nora walked in together. The room went quiet. Not the good kind, the kind where people suddenly find their hands real interesting. Nora hadn't been to town since the silencing. The whispers started before they reached the second row of chairs. "Brought her out in public. Can you believe? Still won't talk. I hear. Holbrook situation. Such a shame." Mrs. Marlowe sat near the front, dressed fine, hat pinned just so. She leaned toward the woman beside her, voice pitched to carry the way cruel voices always know how to carry. "I don't know why he brings her. She never did have anything worth saying." The room heard it. Every soul in that schoolhouse heard it, and not one person said a word. Nora's hands tightened in her lap. Josiah felt it, not the trembling, but the stillness, the gathering, the way silence changes right before it breaks. He stood up. The room went quiet again, different this time. "I reckon most of you know me by now," he said, voice steady, not loud, didn't need to be. "I've been working the Holbrook Ranch since January, fixing fence, moving cattle, learning the land, and everything I know about that place, I learned from one person." He looked down at Nora. She looked up at him. "Her name is Nora Holbrook Dunn, and she has something worth saying." He sat down. The room held its breath. Nora stood. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her skirt and held them still. The schoolhouse was silent, that thick, watchful silence that fills a room when everyone knows something is about to change, and nobody's sure which direction it'll go. She looked out over the faces, some curious, some hostile, some ashamed. She didn't talk about the Marlowes. Didn't relitigate the past, didn't demand apologies or explanations or justice for what they'd taken from her. She talked about the spring roundup, the shared water rights on Beaver Creek, the 3 fence lines between the Holbrook, McCready, and Cooper ranches that needed repair before calving season. She talked about the land, their land, all of them, and what it needed. Her voice shook on the first word. By the second sentence it steadied. By the third it filled every corner of that schoolhouse the way lamplight fills a dark room warm, reaching everywhere, leaving nowhere to hide. She spoke for 3 minutes, maybe 4, And when she finished, the silence that followed was nothing like the silence that had kept her prisoner. This silence was the kind that follows truth, the kind that asks people what they're going to do about what they just heard. Mrs. Marlowe gathered her things and walked out. Nobody followed her. Outside, old Doyle was waiting by the wagon. His eyes were wet again. "Your mama talked just like that," he said quietly. Same voice, same fire. Nora touched the old man's arm, then she climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Josiah. The spring air smelled like thawing earth and new grass, and the first wild possibility of everything that was about to grow. They came on Saturday. Not everyone, but enough. Wagons started arriving at first light, rolling up the ridge road with lumber and tools and baskets of food, and children running alongside, hollering and laughing. Mrs. Layton, who'd been Nora's mother's friend, who'd sat in that schoolhouse meeting and finally said what she'd been holding back for a year, brought her 3 sons and a ham and an apology she'd been carrying since last winter. "You were right," she told Nora at the gate, her voice steady but her chin quivering. "About all of it. I should have said so a long time ago." Nora took the woman's hands. "You're here now. That's enough." Old Mr. McCready brought nails and a level and his grandson, who was 6 and wanted to help real bad. The Cooper family brought fresh-baked bread and a saw that had been in their family since Missouri. Even the preacher came, though he had the good grace to look uncomfortable and spent most of the morning holding boards for other people. They raised a barn. Josiah worked the frame, sweat and sawdust on his shoulders by mid-morning. Nora was everywhere directing placement, checking measurements, calling people by name. Her voice carried across the worksite, clear and strong and so full of life that more than one person stopped just to listen. "Mr. McCready, that beam's a 1/4 inch left, Cooper boys. I need those joists up here before noon, Doyle. You tell my father he's not coming out of that house. I can see him at the window and I know what he's thinking." Laughter, hammers ringing, children chasing the barn cat through new grass, the sound of a community remembering what it was supposed to be. Josiah paused on the crossbeam, hammer in hand, and looked down at Nora standing in the spring sunlight with wood shavings in her hair and a pencil behind her ear, and her father's planting journal tucked under her arm. She was arguing with McCready's grandson about whether the barn door should face east or south, and she was losing the argument on purpose because the boy was 6 and passionate about it. Her eyes were bright with the kind of joy you can't fake and can't buy and can't earn any way but the hard way. He loved her. That evening, after the wagons rolled home and the dishes were washed and Orrin was asleep in his chair by the fire with a smile on his face for the first time in a year. Nora walked through the house. She opened every window, every door. Spring air poured through the rooms like it had been waiting all winter for an invitation. She found the family Bible on the mantel. Heavy thing, leather-bound. 4 generations of Holbrooks recorded in careful ink. She opened it to the marriages page and dipped the pen. Nora Holbrook Dunn, March 31st, 1883. Not because the ceremony required it. That ceremony had been silence and obligation in a cold church in January. This was choice. She heard his boots on the porch. He stood at the threshold of the bedroom, the one with the iron bolt she'd locked that first night. The door stood wide open. The key sat on the windowsill, catching the last of the sunset. Unnecessary. "The door was always open," he said quietly. "Every morning I brought that firewood. It was unlocked." "I know," she said. "That's why I stayed." She walked to him. He opened his arms and she stepped into them, and his chin rested on the top of her head and her hands pressed flat against his back, and they stood there while the spring evening settled around them, warm and soft and earned. They moved to the porch, side by side, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her waist. The new barn frame stood golden against the sky. Below it, along the porch rail, a row of tiny green shoots poked through dark soil. Lavender, not blooming yet, but growing. Nora said something to him soft, just for the two of them, too quiet for anyone else to hear. He laughed. She laughed. Out past the barn, the creek was running high with snowmelt, and somewhere in the cottonwoods, a meadowlark was singing its fool head off like it had just remembered how. The door behind them stood wide open. Lamplight spilled out warm across the porch boards, reaching toward the dark the way light does when it knows it's welcome. Nobody would need that lock again, so here's what I keep coming back to. She had every reason to stay silent, every reason to keep that door locked and that bolt thrown and her name buried where nobody could use it against her again. And he had every reason to keep drifting, every reason to believe he wasn't worth a mended coat sleeve or a cup of coffee made by somebody else's hands. But she opened the door, and he stayed. So I guess the question is there somebody in your life right now whose name you've stopped saying? Somebody you've walked around like a stone in a creek? And if there is, what would it cost you to say it out loud? This is a fiction story we created for entertainment. We hope it brought something small but good into your day. Thanks for staying through all of that with us.